Hello, everyone. It's really loud. Hi. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're so excited that so many of you could join us today for On the Power of Positive Empathy in Consensual Non-Monogamy. I'm Pele Shalev, the Public Events Specialist here at the California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university on the traditional unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone, also known as San Francisco, and which they call Yelamu. In the Ramaytush Ohlone language, Yelamu identifies both the people and the territory. It is so lovely to see those of you who are gathered here in the room and to share space with all of those who are joining us online and watching this conversation from all over the world. Thanks. As a representative of CIIS, I want to express our debt and gratitude to the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original peoples and continual caretakers of Yelamu, the people and territory of the San Francisco Peninsula. This acknowledgement is only a single small step towards being in deeper connection and relationship with Indigenous tribes and organizations in our community. If you're joining us online, I invite you to call out in the chat where you're calling from. To learn more, we recommend the website native-land.ca as a starting resource. Before we start, I'm going to cover a few troubleshooting items. We will have a live Q&A after the conversation tonight. Since this is a hybrid event, we have a hybrid Q&A process so that our online and in-person guests all have the same chance to participate. Those of you who are here in the room will find QR codes around the room linking to the Q&A form. Online, you'll find that link in the event description below this video. Our presenters will be able to see questions pulled from there at the end of the event, and we will try to get to as many as we can. For those of you online, chat will be enabled during this event, but please note that it is not being moderated, and our presenters cannot see the chat. If you choose to participate in chat, please be respectful and avoid language that could be offensive or insensitive to others. You can turn the chat off at any time, and we encourage you to do so if you find it negatively impacts your experience in any way. Now let me introduce our presenters, Dr. Marie Thouin and Dr. Roger Kuhn, and then we'll get right to the conversation. Dr. Roger Kuhn is a Poarch Creek Two-Spirit Indigequeer somacultural sex therapist, sexuality educator, writer, activist, and musician. Roger's work explores the concepts of decolonizing and unsettling sexuality and focuses on the way culture impacts and informs our bodily experiences. He is a community organizer of the Bay Area American Indian Two-Spirit Powwow and a board member of the Two-Spirit and Native LGBTQ+ Center for Equity. His first book, Somacultural Liberation, is available in both paperback and audio, and his music can be streamed on all digital platforms. Dr. Marie Thouin is a mindful dating and relationship coach who supports people of all backgrounds and orientations in creating intentional love lives. She is also a leading expert and scholar on the topic of compersion in consensual non-monogamy. After graduating from CIIS with a PhD in East-West psychology in 2021, Marie published seminal research studies and the first ever encyclopedia entry on compersion. She's now the author of the groundbreaking book, What is Compersion? Understanding Positive Empathy in Consensually Non-Monogamous Relationships. Her work has been featured in several publications and podcasts, including Elle, The Savage Lovecast, and HuffPost. And now, let me turn it over to Dr. Marie Thouin and Dr. Roger Kuhn.
Good evening and welcome, or maybe I should say good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, at what time you may be watching this at a later date. Marie, it is so great to be with you this evening. My name is Roger Kuhn. Some folks call me Dr. Roger Kuhn. I come from the Poarch Creek Nation. I'm from the Win clan, and I identify as a Nathkaba, which is the term we use in my tribe for two-spirit. Anything you'd like to say about yourself, Marie, before we start?
Thank you, Roger. I'm Dr. Marie Thouin. As Pele shared, I graduated from CIIS in 2021. And I've been doing a lot of coaching since, which has been so wonderful and so educational. So I have one foot in the practice realm, one foot in the scholarly realm. And yeah, I'm just very excited to be with you today. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for being here. And now just a really quick story about Marie and I before we jump into our conversation. Several years ago, I took a class here at CIIS called Love, Sex, and Intimate Relationships. It was part of the PhD program for human sexuality, which I also graduated from. And on the first day of class, this lovely student sat next to me, who happened to be Marie. And we sparked a conversation on that first day, and we've been chatting ever since. That must have been like, what, in 2015? So we've known each other almost a decade that we have been friends. And I just want to say how incredibly proud I am of you for all that you've accomplished, not just personally, professionally, and what you're gifting to the field.
Thank you.
And for those of you that do not know, the book is called What is Compersion? I think you have it here. What is compersion? And I want to actually start there, because for those that are maybe here with us tonight and those that may be watching online, some folks may be unaware of what do you mean by the term, what is compersion? So we're not going to have time to read the whole book together tonight. So we're going to ask for a pretty concise definition, if you could give us one.
Well, that's a great start. So me and my colleague, Dr. Sharon Flicker, co-authored an encyclopedia definition last year in 2023. So I'll start there because that is now the most official version of compersion definition. And we had a lot of conversations about it and decided on a three-pronged definition because we realized that the typical understanding of compersion as simply, well, I'm happy when you're happy, was true but incomplete. So the first definition is that compersion is the broad range of positive emotions that we might experience in relation to our romantic partners, other intimate relationships. So that's the typical understanding of compersion in non-monogamy. It's I'm happy when you're happy with someone else. However, in my research, one of the most important things that I discovered is that compersion can also be thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors. It doesn't only come in the form of an emotion. So the second definition is that compersion is the broad range of positive thoughts, actions, and attitudes that we might experience in relationship to our partner's other relationships. And then the third definition is expanding the concept of compersion to general context. So the broad range of positive thoughts, emotions, attitudes, and behaviors that we might experience in relation to somebody else's happiness or success in any context. Because we did realize that the word was starting to, go beyond the context of consensual non-monogamy.
Well, that speaks to really how language itself evolves and terms, right? We have to remember that all words were created at some point. So we have a term like compersion, which maybe originally thought of as my happiness for your happiness, and now it's evolving into all of these other ways. What would you say is important for our audience to understand about how the term is evolving currently?
Well, the term was coined originally in the 1970s at a community called Carista. It was an intentional polyamorous community in San Francisco that since has disbanded, but that was the first iteration of the word compersion. And it has been used and popularized in non-monogamous communities ever since, but always with this kind of more or less vague definition. So in recent years, there's just been a few more research studies that has sought to understand what it is at a deeper level. And also, I think one of those things has been to remove the shame from people who might want to feel compersion but are not feeling compersion. Because when I started researching that topic, a lot of what I would hear from the polyamorous community is, well, I feel bad about this word, about this concept in and of itself, because I feel like if I'm not feeling it, I'm not poly enough. So I think that the more we understand what it really is and how fluid it is, the less shame there is around it.
Mm-hmm. And just for folks who may not know, could you just give us a quick definition of poly and or polyamorous?
Oh, thank you for asking. Yes. So consensual non-monogamy is an umbrella term that designates all the forms of non-monogamies that are consensual, that are happening with the consent and the knowledge of everyone involved. But polyamory is under that umbrella, and it's often used interchangeably, but the specific definition of polyamory is those relationships where there are concurrent relationships happening, but are also emotional, not just sexual. So there is emotional commitment with more than one person at the same time.
Now, you were sharing that maybe traditionally, or how the word was originally used or thought of, was in those sort of CNM, consensual non-monogamy, or poly sort of relations. And as the term has evolved, I'm curious about ways in which folks may experience compersion sort of outside of maybe what we think of as a romantic and or intimate sexual relationship. Does compersion also exist between friends?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. As we were just talking about on our way here, you know, I was celebrating your successes recently and you were celebrating mine. So I feel like friendships are some of the relationships where compersion can really bloom. But I would also add to that sometimes sibling relationships, parental relationships, business and work relationships, really anywhere in life where we really care about each other, there's room for envy, jealousy, and compersion.
And sort of to go with the topic of tonight's talk, empathy.
Yes.
Yeah, and maybe we should just also quickly define empathy and sort of how you're thinking about empathy as it relates to compersion.
Such a great fundamental question. So empathy also has two main definitions. One is in the realm of sensate empathy, meaning I feel what you feel. When you experience that kind of contagion, emotional contagion with someone, like you see someone who's sad and all of a sudden you feel that sadness in your body, that would be called contagion, emotional contagion. But there's also another form of empathy called cognitive empathy, where it's I can imagine what you feel. I might experience someone who's sad and just think, oh my gosh, I remember when I was sad. Okay, I have this cognitive relationship, but I'm not necessarily in the embodied feeling of it. And that actually is very relevant to my book and my study of compersion, because I found that there are two kinds of compersion, embodied compersion and cognitive or attitudinal compersion, which really map well onto those two forms of empathy.
Would you say that it's necessary to have empathy when one is working toward understanding compersion, or maybe developing, I'm going to use the word skill, like to navigate as a skill to sort of, hey, my partner or my partners have introduced something new to me, and I'm working on the skill to embrace that part of them. Is it necessary to have empathy in order to feel compersion?
Well, I don't think it's necessary to have embodied empathy. And I actually have a chapter in my book where I talk about the spectrum of compersion that goes from what I call benevolent neutrality to attitudinal compersion to embodied compersion. And all of these shades of compersion, I would say, qualify as this idea that we can be in wholehearted support of our partners at our relationships. And some of these flavors of compersion will be akin to that cognitive empathy, or just, you know, like a positive acceptance. Like, okay, my partner is enjoying their relationship with somebody else. I'm not in bliss about it, but I also am generally interpreting that as a positive event. All the way to, oh, wow, I am really feeling their happiness and I want to hear more because that is making me so happy to see them happy. And is the embodied kind necessary or even better? I would say no, it's not necessary or not necessarily better. What I think is more fundamental is to be on the same team.
When you were talking earlier about action and or behavior as being one of the definitions, maybe like the number 2 definition of compersion. I was thinking, you just said a moment ago, I want to hear more. Would that be an example of behavioral compersion, to say to your partner, I want to hear more about your experience? Or is there another way that shows up for people in terms of like maybe how your informants talked about action and or behavior?
I actually can color that with a little story from one of my participants who was pretty much the extreme of behavioral compersion without embodied compersion. And he said that he used to have a partner who was a bisexual woman. And because she wanted to have lovers who were women, he was not really excited about it. Maybe his feelings were even a little bit hurt about it, but he felt like it was his duty as a good husband to support her, and he would even like drive her to meet his other partners, her other partners, pardon. And for him, that was behavioral compersion. He was not in a state of emotional contagion, but he felt that this was the way he could show up in full support of his partner's fulfillment.
And so I remember this section in your book, and I don't remember exactly, was the partner that was driving, was your informant?
Yes.
Yeah. And so I'm curious if the terms either envy or jealousy were present for that informant prior to even be able to have that behavior.
Both would coexist in his case, and that is actually the case for many people. And that's another chapter in the book, is the coexistence of jealousy and compersion, where yes, in his case, he was feeling this envy, this jealousy, sometimes a little bit of grief about not being the only partner. But at the same time, he would experience this compersion, and in his case, as this sense of duty. This is how I support my partner. I don't want to prevent her from living her life and being fully expanded, so I'm going to show up in that way. And to me, that speaks to a compersive ethic, an orientation towards relationships where, sometimes we might have more than one thing going on at once. We might have a part of us that feels a little bit insecure, a little bit, like not so thrilled, but we decide to act in a way that feels aligned with our values. And to me, that can be very transformative.
How would you differentiate jealousy and envy?
Yeah, good question. Jealousy is, in the words of my colleague Jolie Hamilton, who is a wonderful researcher of jealousy, she says, jealousy is like a triangle. There is you, there is the person that you love or want, and then there's a perceived interrupter. So jealousy is when you feel that your valued relationship with a precious other is under threat. So if you're in a relationship with someone and they are interested in dating someone else and you perceive that person as a threat to your relationship, that's jealousy. Envy is more of a straight line. It's, I want something that you have. I think you have the better jacket tonight.
I think you're correct. I think you are correct, Marie.
I'm a little envious.
How many other people are envious of this jacket? It's okay. There you go. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
But I'm also very happy for you.
Thank you.
I know you get all the compliments today. That's okay.
I wanted to go back to something you said a moment ago. I'm a clinician, I'm a therapist, so I heard you use the word grief. And there may be other clinicians, therapists here. There's probably some watching online as well. And immediately I thought about that acceptance stage of grief. And I always say that when we think about grief and we think about acceptance doesn't mean that it's over. Acceptance means I've gotten to the point in my experience where I can say this thing is happening or this thing has happened. And so I'm curious, in that particular case you mentioned with your informant, because you said there was some grief there. And I just now am wondering, how how might we think about compersion for those that may be struggling, for those that maybe are the first time exploring a CNM or first time exploring an open relationship, and there is some grief there. And then they might go through all of those stages, right? The anger, the bargaining, the denial, and they might get to that point of acceptance. And I'm wondering, I don't know if your research covers that or if you've talked to maybe Jolie around this, around what role might grief and acceptance play in how someone can get to that either embodied or that cognitive place when we're thinking about compersion.
Yeah, I will say that compersion is very contextual. It's not something that you either have or don't have. And once you have it, it can always go away. There's always, like the fluidity of the context that we need to take into consideration. And that grief definitely can be part of the context. And it is really a journey for people, especially if they're coming from a background of lifelong monogamy, which the vast majority of us are. We have to grieve sometimes a worldview that is fed to us by, from the time we're born. It's this idea that if someone really loves you, they will want only you. And that script can be, like it can die hard in a sense, like we have to grieve that concept or that idea. And, oftentimes just the relationship that two people create in a monogamous context is based on some of these values and scripts, but also some dynamics that are very much, like the security between two people can be based on that exclusivity, that romantic or sexual exclusivity. So in order to transition to a non-monogamous partnership, people have to grieve the previous iteration of their partnership and what made them special or what they rested their sense of security upon. And they have to oftentimes then create a new iteration of their relationship where security is no longer based on exclusivity, but it can be based on other qualities of uniqueness. Like, how do we have a unique love story? How do we have security, even if we're not the only one? So yes, it can take years, in most cases, for people to grieve that mononormativity. Also, mononormativity is this assumption that monogamy is the only real valid way to love and have relationships. So it's definitely a process. Yeah. And the more that people can grieve it, the more there can be room for that positive empathy. And I'll actually maybe just add a little quote from a participant who told me that for them, compersion is positive empathy with cultural expectations removed. Ooh. I just love that.
Well, that sort of speaks to, from a cultural perspective, everyone in this room speaks mononormativity, not because they may actually practice mononormativity. That is the language, that is the cultural language we have all been raised with culturally, if you grew up, I should say, in the United States. The same way that I would say we all speak heterosexual fluently, even though we may not be heterosexual, that's because that's the dominant language that we're all taught, right? And in the same way, we also know, I could say culturally, that wasn't necessarily the case with indigenous communities prior to colonization, that there was different ways to think about how we can be in relation, how we can be in community with each other, with partners, etc. So this idea of mononormativity is something that came, I would say, is really not indigenous to these lands, but it's sort of an ideology that was put upon people. So when you start to unpack this idea of mononormativity, there's a lot of layers that you have to unpack as well. And hopefully you find the root to say, actually my expansiveness, my capacity to love many things. And if you all don't know the work of Dr. Kim Tallbear, I highly recommend you check it out, because Kim always says, talks about the way that, nobody ever questions us if we love our dogs or if we love nature. But suddenly when we love another person in this way, then we get all those feelings of jealousy and or envy that arrive. But true, sort of to bring in that decolonial, that decolonizing sexuality frame would be to say that actually what you're talking about, compersion, CNM, the multiplicity of what's capable between more than one humans is really what would be getting us back to the foundations of truth in these lands.
Mhm.
I wanted to ask about culture in a way, which is, I'm curious if you have found in your research, there are different, say, groups or socioeconomic statuses, different gender presentations for which compersion and or even a CNM perspective you found more apparent.
Well, I want to premise that with saying that CNM, people who practice CNM are very diverse. You know, there is this, I would say, this archetype or the stereotype of non-monogamous people as white, middle to upper class, heterosexual people. And this is usually what we see represented in the media. And that is not actually what's happening. It's usually that people are signing up for studies or, you know, have found themselves in those kind of representative roles. But truly, the populations that practice CNM have been found to be very equally distributed across the political spectrum, socioeconomic spectrum, gender identity spectrum, sexual orientation spectrum, and racial and cultural spectrum. So is it easier for some groups than others to experience compersion? Is that kind of your question?
Well, somewhat, you know, I would say that I am not originally from California. I've lived here over a decade and I love living in California now. Though when I first arrived, I remember very early into my time in California, someone was hitting on me in a rather aggressive way, I found. And I said, well, no, you know, I'm married. And their response was, so what? And I mean, I was like, what? Like that is, I lived in New York. People didn't, like, where I was from, people weren't talking like that. Like it was, you know, it was a little bit more, that was very direct. And then I was like, wow, the Bay is the Bay. You know, they have the Bay, okay. You know, and I really began to expand even how I thought about what was even possible for me, because I just, you know, culturally, it just wasn't something that at least my friends were talking about back in New York or what I was seeing in the community. But here, it seemed like it was more prevalent or folks were just more willing to openly discuss these types of things. And there's a specific culture to the Bay, right? Oftentimes people talk about the Bay bubble. And I'm wondering, what is it about the water here? You know, that the hetchy water, right? That it maybe allows for these things. I say that somewhat in jest, but also to say there is something about this region where these kind of conversations are more prevalent. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Oh, that's such a great question. You know, like there are definitely hotspots for non-monogamy communities in the United States, and the Bay is top of list. And I would say that it's probably for some of the same reasons why we also have a thriving LGBTQ community.
Yeah.
You know, we tend to be at the cutting edge of, you know, like diversity and acceptance. You know, when I first moved to the Bay Area 20 plus years ago, I got so thrilled because I felt like finally I could be as weird as I wanted to be. No one would look twice. That was why I fell in love with the Bay Area. And yeah, I don't know what's in the water. But I think that diversity of sexual orientation and diversity of relationship orientation, and really maybe more forms of diversity, you know, gender identity, racial diversity, etc., often goes hand in hand. And what I found in my research is that when you break one form of normativity, it's oftentimes easier to break others. For example, someone who has already come out as queer might already find themselves in a space of questioning, like, okay, well, if one social norm was not really for me, maybe other social norms are not for me either. Maybe the kind of mainstream culture doesn't really have my back. It can go two different ways though, because for some people they might say like, wow, I don't want to have to fight yet one more battle or lose yet one more area of privilege. So it depends on people's access to community, supportive community, and also maybe other areas of privilege or oppression.
I'd like to talk about that for a moment around what about community? What about someone, a couple that was monogamous at one point, then they make the choice that they want to explore new things, and they're experiencing all the things we've talked about tonight. They are experiencing that sense of empathy and compersion within the relationship, though their friends now are looking at them differently, or their family is looking at them differently. I'm curious around just your thoughts. How might, if someone should choose to share that with others about my partner and I have decided to engage in this, which would be a private choice that they would make anyway, though what might someone prepare for in terms of if there's pushback from other people in their lives?
Well, I would definitely advise people to go slower than not. A little bit, again, it's a coming out process, and it is against the grain, and it is very triggering for a lot of people. The idea of non-monogamy, I know firsthand, can trigger a lot of people. So I would recommend for people to first get really clear within themselves in terms of feeling in the place of complete self-consent with their choice, so that if someone else gives them negative feedback, it doesn't throw them for a loop of self-doubt. So first, getting clear and solid within yourself. And then starting small, starting with people that you feel fairly safe with and feel like will, like give you acceptance, and starting with people who might already practice non-monogamy. That's why I think communities are so important, because they help validate our identities. And then going outside of that, just, like having that solidity and having that patience. I mean, I can imagine, like coming out as queer is a very similar process, like who are you gonna tell first? You're gonna choose people who it feels a little safer before choosing people where it feels edgier. But coming at these conversations with self-alignment, I think is key.
That idea of like coming out, right, is really interesting to me as someone that does identify as queer, gay, two-spirit, etc. Because I always say like, well, I'm just returning to who I always was. This idea that I'm returning to who I was, right, before all of these ideas were, put into my head. And for some, they may be returning that this idea that I have this expansiveness within me to love and to be with multiple people may just be a returning. Perhaps we could argue we may all be that way, and we've been conditioned to believe that we must practice things a particular way. Though, if we think about even friendship, right? Like, I was so excited. I was so happy, genuinely really happy when Marie got her book deal. I was so happy because I know, I think I may have gotten my book deal shortly before you did. And I really wanted Marie to get a book deal too, right? And I just wanted that for my friend. And when you did, I felt a deep, embodied experience of joy for you, that yes, this is happening for you. And to me, I feel that way quite often. I find it really odd. I'm going to take a little social media, but I'm going to turn this to technology in just a moment. When you're on social media, the other day I posted a video, and I think it got like 1,000 views and like 15 likes. And I'm like, who was watching the video and not hitting the like button? Hit the like button. Like, I don't understand why someone might engage with your content and not hit the like button. It seems very strange to me. Because I'm like one of those people that's like, because you're my friend. I want to like your thing, right? I know how the algorithms work. The more you like it, the more it goes up and those things. So I don't know if that would be an example of the behavioral aspects of compersion, but I am almost all day I could just sit on my phone liking things because I genuinely feel that way. I genuinely feel that way for my friends and my friendships. Though I do want to talk about technology.
Yes.
And sort of how we think about technology and the role it may play in compersion, to say, wow, I saw this post that my friend had, I'm so excited. And also how that can elicit a lot of envy and jealousy as well. What are your thoughts about technology and compersion, or social media and compersion?
I think social media is such a great mirror for envy, jealousy, and compersion. And actually, as we were talking about on our way here, I sometimes, like seeing all of your successes and other successes of my friends on social media, have noticed parts of me getting envious. And then noticing, oh, wow, I'm feeling envy here. I'm like clicking the like button, but there's a little bit of like, a little ouch. Like, I don't have that. I don't do that. And I think that moment of noticing is so important and so potentially alchemical, because then you can choose, who are you going to be? What are you going to do? How are you going to show up? Okay, there's a part of me that is now indicating like there's something that I want that I'm not getting, or that I perceive this other person is getting. Can I use that ouch or that energy to go get more of what I want? And actually to turn towards rather than turn away.
Yeah.
I do catch myself sometimes not even wanting to hit the like button because of my own envy. I'm embarrassed to say it, but I just want to be vulnerable. I think it probably happens to most of us. That like, God damn you, you're like too successful. And that comparison that can happen. It's all too human. And I am training myself constantly to turn towards and to say like, oh no, oh my gosh, this person is killing it. And I can do it too in my own way. We all have a unique path. I think also recognizing that we all have a unique gift, and to tap into our gifts, our own expressions of love and creativity in the world, and to move towards that, and then to move towards each other, to celebrate each other's successes, can just really be transformative and empowering. And I think that is the kind of medicine that we need more of in the world. What if we trained ourselves to notice those moments where we separate, where we distance ourselves from each other because of that pain of jealousy and envy, and actually like turned towards ourselves first of all and say like, okay, how can I take care of myself in that tender place? How can I give to myself? How can I get more of what I really deeply desire? And then how can I turn towards that other person? Deeply healing.
Yeah. In full transparency, I also shared with Maria that I too experience envy with her career from time to time. So it's, it's a mutual thing. And more though happiness, right? It's always that, oh gosh, Marie's doing this thing and I want to do that thing, and good for Marie. I still like it. I will still like the post myself, though I do have that kind of experience of like, oh, I would like to speak at that bookstore. And I think that's really interesting. And I think this is a question that I'm very curious, again, I sort of putting on my clinical hat here, is that sense when you feel or understand that, oh, I've got this feeling, I've got this sensation, or there's an emotion emerging within me, whether that be envy, jealousy, and or happiness or compersion. What do we do with that? That moment when we recognize that we have choice, I think can be one of the most transformative and powerful things for human beings to experience. Like, we have a choice in this moment. What do I do with it?
Right.
Yeah.
A question that just came to mind right now that can be a very clarifying question is, how do we not weaponize our jealousy and our envy? How do we not weaponize it against ourselves or against anyone else?
Yeah.
What would happen if we did not, what possibilities could be born?
We often think of empathy as something I do to you or toward, and rarely do we recognize we also have empathy for ourselves. And in those moments of, oh, there's that struggle, how can I have some empathy for myself in this moment?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm wondering, now that we're sort of, you mentioned parts. I love parts work, internal family systems. I think it's really, really fascinating. And I'm wondering about the parts within self that might experience conflict with, here's the part of me that experiences the compersion, here's the part of me that experiences the jealousy. How do we navigate those two in a way that allows for what might be the more present experience, not necessarily the loudest, because oftentimes jealousy and envy may be louder than the compersion, I would imagine, sort of thinking about my own clinical practice, right? The folks don't come to me because they're happy. Folks come to me because they're experiencing, jealousy or envy, right? So how do we be with those parts of ourselves to normalize, just like we did a moment ago, to say, yeah, we still experience envy, even though we're dear friends, to normalize those experiences. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I think to name those experiences is usually a great first step. And actually, me and Jolie Hamilton, the jealousy researcher, coined a word for that last year because we both work with people and we see a lot of people coming with this conflict between feeling jealousy and wanting to feel compersion, or having an attitude of compersion, but jealous triggers. And we coined the word comper struggle.
Comper struggle.
Yes.
I like that.
And to name that comfort struggle, to name the fact that, wow, like I really do want to show up in full support, in full participation with your happiness. But there's also these parts of me that are rebelling, that are angry, that are sad, that are grieving, that are fearful, that are feeling betrayed even. To be able to first name it for ourselves, and then to be able to communicate with our partners in a way that feels safe for the relationship, not just putting the blame and creating harm in the relationship, but to voice it in a safe space that can be vulnerable, that can be so healing. Because oftentimes the worst part in all this, the worst part of having a comper struggle or struggling with jealousy, is the shame that comes with it. No one wants to be called or seen as a jealous person, especially in a polyamorous or non-monogamous community, where sometimes it's even more like, oh, if you're experiencing too much jealousy, you might be seen as, not in for the party, or it depends. I don't want to say that all communities are like that, but I've heard that from a lot of people where they felt that they were not doing a good job at being non-monogamous because they were struggling with jealousy. So I think it's super important to create those safe conversations with the people around us, to be able to bring all of ourselves and then choose how are we going to show up.
Therapists and clinicians, by the way, are not immune to jealousy and or envy. And in particular, when you're working in the realm of sexuality, as I do clinically, I always tell my clients, I don't need to know the details of what you're talking about. The important thing therapeutically is how you feel about those things. That's why you're here. And if you want to share, I'm more than happy. And trust, I hear all kinds of things. People tell me all kinds of things. And I have found myself from time to time kind of going like, I've never heard that before. That's interesting. I get curious about it. I want to lean in a little bit more. That's the work to do outside of the session. I think, Marie, that what you have done, the conversation that you have added to, is so important from a clinical perspective. What do you think is important for those of us that practice either psychotherapy and or coaching of some kind to really understand about people who are struggling with either jealousy or envy, and or struggling with because they are experiencing compersion and they feel as if their community is rejecting them because of it? More from a clinician's perspective, if you have an idea of how, because I don't know if other clinicians ever got any training around compersion, I got zero. And it's a relatively newer term for me, in terms of the clinical work. That I don't really have the training for it. So I don't want to just pretend like I know what the person's talking about. I feel like there needs to be more training. This book is great. This book, by the way, just a little plug for my friend, should be in every couples counseling or relational counseling course, because it is so well written, so well researched, and so accessible that I think it's great for current clinicians or those that are training. But I'm wondering if you have a perspective on the importance that a clinician or a coach could play in helping someone either develop their sense of compersion and or work with their envy and jealousy.
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. And there is a lot in that book about this. I think from the jealousy perspective, there is a chapter called Developing a Non-Mononormative Relationship to Jealousy as a factor in promoting compersion. And I think that's a really important perspective to understand. And more importantly, like people often comes to people like you and me wanting to experience more compersion. And what we need to understand as clinicians or coaches like I am is that you cannot spiritual bypass yourself into compersion. Knowing the word is helpful because it can give you an idea of what is possible. But what is more important is to understand how to create a fertile terrain for it. Because compersion will emerge more or less naturally when different factors are in place. And I actually developed a worksheet that people can download on my website, whatiscompersion.com, to identify how they land on different factors, such as those individual, relational, and social factors that I found either promote or hinder compersion. So the more people can enrich their terrain at these different levels, whether it's with their relationship with themselves, with their relationship with their partners, with their relationships with their metamors, who are their partners' other partners, with their relationships with their communities and how much support they have. All of these will really impact whether or not or how much compersion someone might expect to feel or experience. So a coach or a therapist can look at these factors and say like, okay, like how can we work on all these different levels? How can we make your relationship with yourself stronger? How can we make your relationship with your partners stronger? Can we, like work on the communication, on the sense of safety, on the sense of trust that is happening there? How do you feel about their other relationships? Can we create a meaning making that is in alignment with your values and what you want to create and how you feel about all this? Like, let's get real and really look at what does this all mean to you? So there's, the narrative perspective of what this means to you, and there's the how do you create safety in your nervous system, etc. There's so many angles that clinicians can work with in order to create that fertile terrain.
Wonderful. In just a few moments, folks, we are going to be taking some questions for Dr. Thouin. So if you have any, if you're here in the audience, just a reminder, you want to scan that QR code and enter your question there. And those that are watching and joining us online, you want to just enter those into the chat field, and we will be getting to those comments and questions and comments in just a few moments. I want to know for you, as I mentioned, your book is incredibly well researched, and you are a scholar. And where would you like to take your research next?
There is so much to do in this field. Really, I think that my book is scratching the surface in a sense because it is the first comprehensive scholarly book. But truly, I would love to research compersion in different communities, sub-communities of non-monogamy, such as, solo polyamorous people who are deciding to actually like have their self relationship as their first relationship and other relationships as being, not primary. And also, people who practice swinging or people who practice open relationship versus polyamory. So that would be a really great research study. And I would also love to research compersion outside of consensual non-monogamy. How does it show up in collegial relationships, in sibling relationships, in friendships? Like, and what are the factors there? How does it differ, and how does it not differ from non-monogamy? So yeah, there is so much to be still uncovered. And another angle that really interests me and probably will interest you is the somatic side of compersion. How can somatic practitioners really help people embody, those new feelings and emotions? Like really understanding how it works in the body would be fascinating.
Thank you for that. As you were sharing, I was thinking back to something I thought of earlier in our conversation, which is the origins of the term compersion and how it's really been used for quite some time within the CNM poly open relationship. And now we're talking about possibly using the term between friends, family, siblings, etc. And I just wonder how, if you've asked anyone from the CNM community, how they might feel about the term evolving to then be used in other areas. Because sometimes, folks want to take, that's our term, right?
Well, while I was discussing the encyclopedia definition with my colleague Sharon Flicker, I was also talking to other colleagues about that. How should we define it? Should we include contexts other than non-monogamy? And I got different feedback on that. Some people were very pro. They were like, yeah, of course, we don't really have another word for this in English, so we need it. And I mean, as a matter of fact, it actually kind of helps normalize non-monogamy to extend that meaning to other contexts. And some people were against it because they felt like, no, this word was coined in a context of non-monogamy and this should stay our word. But it seemed like, to me, the pros outweighed the cons, but also, I think more so, you can't stop people from using the word how they're going to use it. And I think that my research really reflects that, is people telling me how they were experiencing compersion and how they were using the term. And that included things like attitudinal compersion and things like compersion outside of their romantic or intimate relationships. So the research really reflects that qualitative research from the interviews that I conducted.
Marie and I both went to school here, so I'm about to say something about CIIS in a positive way, which is this is a school that oftentimes allows folks to think beyond traditional sort of academic parameters, right? And I know when you and I were talking a week and a half ago or so, I said to you, like, well, what did your department think of your research? Did you get any pushback from your department? And you shared that really wasn't an issue that you experienced. And then I asked, like, well, what would you think if you had gone to a different school? What if you went to like San Francisco State? Or what if you went to Berkeley? What do you think would have been their perspective around what you're talking about? Which, again, for some folks can be very threatening, right? Even in a maybe even in, that's why I asked about like your department. Like, was your department sort of threatened by this idea that you were talking about the expansiveness? And so I'm just curious about your thought around like sort of the role that academia or the scholarly world plays in the dissemination of the ideology of compersion.
Well, I think that I personally got really lucky with my department and with the professors who were really on my team from the beginning, who had a personal interest in that topic. But I was actually shocked when I was here at CIIS, noticing how open-minded the student body was. But when I talked about sexuality, there was a lot of contraction. It seemed like everything else was allowed. We could talk about psychedelics, we could talk about altered states of consciousness, we could talk about so many out-of-the-box topics, but sexuality and non-monogamy was still pretty scary. I think that times are starting to change. I'm starting to sense, and also seeing the statistics of people who are now intrigued or even adopting non-monogamy. It's definitely on a steep incline nationally. But I do think that there are hubs, like you said, there's something in the water in the Bay Area. But if also I was to go and try to study compersion in a different location, that might not have gone so well.
Mm-hmm. And at the top of our time, it was mentioned that you have been on several different podcasts, including Savage Love, which has an international audience. I'm curious around how your work is landing outside of the Bay. Have you talked to folks in the Midwest yet? Have you talked to folks down in where my folks are from, Alabama, right, who might have a different perspective around these things? Have you reached out to those folks, and if so, what's the feedback been?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's definitely less community support for people who live outside of big metropolitan areas. And, I had some of my research participants for my study who were in smaller places or more, like more remote places where they did not have access to non-monogamous community. I also have a lot of coaching clients who live in places outside of California or outside of big cities who struggle more. And oftentimes for those folks, they rely more on online communities. I have friends who host something called the Normalizing Non-Monogamy community, and that's an online platform which, they have people from all different countries, all different towns across the US who want that kind of platform where they can be themselves and express themselves and make friends. So I think the value of technology here cannot be overstated. But then the difficulty in coming out and being fully oneself outside, of one's relationship, that is such a big factor in promoting compersion. And when you can't be yourself in your community, it can be more difficult. So I just, I wish that everyone had access to supportive community and just that society would move towards more acceptance of relationship diversity. Just like we're moving towards more acceptance of all kinds of diversities, sexual orientation, racial, cultural diversity, gender diversity, etc. I think that relationship diversity is sort of this next milestone or next frontier. And we need to talk about it because, about 5% of Americans are currently in a consensually non-monogamous relationship, and 20% have been at some point. So it's a pretty substantial proportion of people.
Folks, we are just about out of our time for this portion. We are going to open it up to some questions. So just again, for those in the audience, if you do have questions, we ask that you use the QR code. So write your question down, scan the QR code, because we're not going to be able to pass the mic around because, again, we're recording for folks online and recording for the podcast. We want you to use the QR code. For those that are online, how you doing? We ask that you put those in the chat field. Friend, I just want to once again say congratulations to you. I think what you are offering the world really is such a gift. And I want to give you one last moment. If there's one little piece of sparkle, if you will, that you can leave our guests with tonight around either your work or compersion and or your book.
I do have a few favorite quotes from my book, and maybe I'll read one that, to me, I think goes to the core of why I had such a spark around the topic of compersion. And it is compersion as an expression of romance. Because to me, compersion is romantic. I just think that empowering people that we love to be more of themselves is such a deep act of love. So I'll just read you that quote plus a quote of my participant who I pseudonymed to protect confidentiality. While the traditional romantic paradigm centers jealousy and possession as a main feature of passionate love, folks in my study found that giving their partner what they really want, including the encouragement to fulfill one's intimate desires with others, was a romantic stance of the highest order. They saw taking pleasure in their partner's pleasure as a gift of devotion and deep love. Tyrone, a 38-year-old facilitator, described compersion as a quote-unquote romance joy or quote unquote, romantic joy. And then I quote Tyrone saying, I love that compersion is romantic. I feel this level of romantic joy. I would do anything for you. And I get to see that you are getting this thing that I know you want. And I love to see you in bliss and pleasure. I love to see that, and I love to witness that. It's a level of intimacy and connection and partnership. It's just like if my partner says, I like flowers, and I bring them flowers once in a while. If their desire is to be tied up and have a girl or a guy present and play with them, to me, it's the same thing. It's like, I'm going to give you the thing that I know you enjoy, because that's how I show my love, by intentionally giving you what you actually want, what gives you joy, the things that you desire in your life. I want to give that to you because I'm your partner.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for giving us a bit of what we want, which is your intellect, your joy, your beautiful smile, and all the things. So folks, if you would just join me in thanking Dr. Marie Thouin for sharing so much with us tonight. I know I've learned so much from your book, and I learned a lot from our talk tonight. So merci, Mado, thank you so much. And we're gonna open it up to some questions.
Give it up for Roger, please.
Thank you.
This is so.
Give it up for the jacket, folks, for the
Yes.
jacket. All
Best
right.
jacket, best conversation partner, and amazing
you.
friend.
Thank you. This is a question from the audience. How do relationship hierarchies get in the way of empathy, compersion, and individuation?
How do relationship hierarchies get in the way of compersion, empathy, and individuation? Great question. So I do have a section in the book that talks about couple privilege and hierarchy, which I would say are two different things. I've definitely seen people have descriptive hierarchies, really feel like in order for them to, have a harmonious relationship ecosystem, they do need to prioritize one relationship in some very practical ways, where they don't dehumanize their other partners. I think oftentimes hierarchies have a bad rap in non-monogamous communities because people who are not part of the quote unquote primary couple or established partnership can end up being dehumanized or feeling discarded or feeling like their feelings don't matter as much. But I think when everyone is comfortable in their roles and everyone really treats each other with the kind of care and nuance and love that, we can have, for people in our relationship ecosystems, then the hierarchy per se does not have to harm the compersion or the individuation or the empathy. But when it does is when people just really center the couple in a way that dehumanizes others or deprioritizes the feelings of someone else. And, I wish I knew more about individuation to answer that question with even more complexity. I can kind of start to conceptualize it, how sometimes when we get in a couple, we start almost like merging our identities, and oftentimes opening up a relationship to non-monogamy can require this deep individuation process where you can't just like have this codependent psychic relationship, so to speak. But I would just really recommend for people to be super clear about why they want a hierarchy and how do they treat partners that are outside of that established relationship.
Great, thank you. This is a question from Denise, maybe one of our online listeners. Are humans born with an innate set point for compersion, or can compersion be taught as a learned skill?
Thank you, Denise. I do have a chapter that is called Can Compersion Be Learned? So yes, it can definitely be learned. But I also think that we are born with an inherent capacity for empathy and for positive empathy. If you imagine a baby playing with their mom, and the mom is smiling and happy, and the baby just lights up. We are also born with capacity for jealousy. It has been observed in infants as young as 6 months old. So I think we have the potential for both, for all of these different emotions. And my study participants have consistently told me that compersion was more of a reclaiming of who they really were rather than learning something foreign. Again, I'll quote this participant who said that for her, compersion is a form of positive empathy with cultural expectations removed. And she felt like as she was peeling the layers of what was not truly her, she was able to just tap into the compersion that was there the whole time, but hidden.
This is a question from Regina. She asks, any connection between compersion and jealousy and lifestyle factors such as careers or religious communities that promote or discourage competition or collaboration?
Yes, great question. Well, what came to mind first is just how people have a sense of abundance in their lives, or a sense of a full plate or a full cup. And when I heard, like career, my first thought was like sometimes people are so busy, with their career and so involved with their career that they feel like there is no bandwidth for, that kind of relational work that non-monogamy can require. But I think what you meant was more like, like the cultures around competition and sharing. And well, I think in general, we live in a culture that very much promotes competition, a capitalist society where we learn to compare ourselves to one another, through, like how much money are we making? How much money is this person making? Who's more successful? Like there is that kind of in the air competition. With religions and forms of spirituality, I think that can sometimes mitigate it. Like when there's the sense of, oh, like actually we do want to be on the same side. We do want to challenge those impulses that are inherent in us to feel jealous, and we want to practice loving in spite of that. That can mitigate it. But I think there's also the culture in our families of origin. When I think about how I was raised, there was this sense of like, yeah, share, but more importantly, act like you're sharing.
Oh.
Yeah. There wasn't really this culture of deep sharing. There was this sense of like, yeah, like share enough so that you're not an asshole, but take care of yourself first. And I think, like we all grew up in like micro cultures, and these are sometimes like as important to consider as the bigger cultural forces.
Thank you. This is a question from the audience. How do you guide clients whose partners seem to be coercing them into non-monogamy? What's the difference between gaining compersion and being morally pressured by a partner to open the relationship?
Right. And that's when the theme of consent is very relevant. One of the main obstacles to compersion that I talk about in the book is to be poly under duress. And that is when you are not in a space of full consent or even full self-consent in entering non-monogamy. And that, of course, will be one of the main barriers to compersion right off the bat. Like you have to be fully on board in order to experience compersion. But fully on board doesn't mean you have to be like, hell yeah. It can be like, okay, this is kind of scary, but I'm going to go into it with a good faith effort and sense of curiosity. And okay, yes, for now, like, but I'm not just acting out of fear of losing my partner. Like there's still something in it for me that I'm willing to explore from a space of agency.
Is that where like the comper struggle might show up?
Sure, yeah. And I think it's okay to have a comper struggle, like most people do. And then it's like, how do you work with it? Like, do you still feel like you're acting from your own autonomy and agency?
A few more questions. This one comes from, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Quinn. I am from a polyamorous culture that was colonized to be monogamous. But then we immigrated to the US and was formed into a monogamous culture, so I experienced different reactions in myself to jealousy, compersion, and envy. It's complex for me. I sometimes want to support my partner in non-monogamy, and sometimes I want the privilege of monogamy. Would love to know your experience with working with folks like me and your input on balancing and navigating different sides of myself around this topic.
Wow, what a beautiful question. I don't usually work with people who come from a culture that is non-monogamous. It's, like usually people coming from a strong monogamous background. But I think most of us can identify and relate to both sides in us. Even me, I wrote this whole book, but I will disclose that I feel like I have both sides. Like I have a side of me that likes the simplicity of monogamy, but there's a part of me that's like, no, I just want the freedom of non-monogamy. And to bring back IFS, internal family systems, the acknowledgement that we have many parts can be so helpful in honoring all of who we are. And I like to also bring up the idea that we don't have to pick a camp forever. Like most of us will not be either monogamous forever or non-monogamous forever. And it's wonderful that we do live in a society where we can navigate sometimes being monogamous if it's from a place of choice and agency. Maybe in different life contexts, we might want to be non-monogamous and have different relationship ecosystems because that's what the ecosystem, that's what wants to be born in you and with people around you. So I would encourage to explore this from a place of fluidity and not from a place of, oh, I have to be in the orthodoxy of monogamy or the orthodoxy of non-monogamy.
This actually leads into the next question from the audience. Can one be polyamorous without being non-monogamous, whereby they only have sexual relations with one person, but love multiple persons?
Ooh, yes, I love that question. That could be also called how would I say that? Polyromantic, but monosexual. The other way around would be, monoromantic, only being in love with one person, but being polysexual, having sex with more than one person. So yes, definitely those distinctions can be made. Why not?
Here's another question. What are the effects of compersion in one's body and mind?
The effects of compersion in one's body and mind. I did ask my study participants, like, how does compersion impact the rest of your life besides, your non-monogamous relationships? And a lot of people said that they felt less competitive in other aspects of their life, such as their workplace. They just had started to dismantle this sense of rivalry and competition everywhere from that experience of compersion. So compersion, we could also describe it as a more kind of expansive, or I want to say like there is a level of relaxation in it. So I would imagine that it could also impact the body in that sense of, relaxation and expansion, but that's more hypothetical.
Here's a question that says, what are the effects of experiencing or expressing one's compersion in interpersonal relationships?
Ooh, can you repeat that one?
What are the effects of experiencing or expressing one's compersion in interpersonal relationships?
Yeah, there is research on that actually that says that it is a strong bonding effect.
Mm.
And I can so speak to that, like when people come to me and they tell me, Marie, I'm so happy for you that you're experiencing such and such success or good thing, or I'm happy that you and your partner are so cute together. I always feel more connected to that person. And the other way around, when I witness something wonderful happening for somebody else, like if I'm at somebody's wedding, for example, I was recently at a wedding and I was in a total compersion heaven because that couple that I love both of them individually and together. They were so adorable. And me being there and participating in their joy and participating in their love and expressing that to them brought us so much closer. So I think that is one of the main ways that we feel seen and loved and accepted by people around us, is when we can feel that, yeah, like they're really on our team because they are choosing to participate in our happiness.
So I'm hearing that as like your friends' posts. Is that, yeah.
I've been liking yours.
Okay, one final question
Yeah.
says, what in your research on compersion surprised you? And what do you think the gaps are in the research?
There were a lot of surprises, actually. One was the distinction between attitudinal and embodied compersion. I did not expect to find that, and that was very revolutionary for me. This idea that you can be compersive without feeling compersion emotionally. I think that was a big surprise and a good surprise. Another area of surprise was my research on social positionality and compersion. I was frankly scared going into that part of the research because I was afraid I was going to find that privilege would correlate with compersion, and I did not find that to be the case. I found that so much more important than privilege is access to community and a tendency to apply independent thinking and, like defy social conventions. So that was surprising, also a good surprise. And what was the last part of that question?
What do you think the gaps are in the research?
The gaps, yeah. Definitely, there is just not enough research in compersion yet. I think doing more research with bigger samples and even just the model of compersion that I developed through my research, that was based on less than 30 people. And it's a really good model, and like the data was saturated, so to speak. Like that means that every person that I interviewed at the end, just what they were saying fit into that model. But I wonder, what if we interviewed, 200 people, 300 people, 1,000 people? Like, would more angles come up? Yeah.
The book is called What is Compersion? Where can they find the book?
They can find it online. They can find it actually
through the bookstore at
here.
CIIS, yeah?
I don't know about the CIIS bookstore here, but
The online bookstore at CIIS, I believe, is where you can get that. If you're online listening, you can. I think there's a way if you on the registration page there is a way that folks could order that. So that's one way. Is it
Okay,
other
great.
on like other like larger?
Yeah, it is on Amazon. It is on Barnes and Noble. It is on Roman and Littlefield, which is my publisher's name. And for people who are here in the room, I actually have about 8 copies that I could sell to you today if you're interested.
And the website is whatiscompersion.com.
That's right.
Wonderful. Folks, please join me once again in thanking Dr. Marie Thouin for her time, her generosity, and her kindness and empathy that she has shared with us all tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you all so much for being here.